I had a fight with my husband, and to get even, I slept with his son. I'm Vivian. I'm 37, and I've been married to Frank for 7 years. When we met, I had just come out of a difficult relationship, and he was a kind of refuge. Frank was the kind of solid, practical man who knew what he wanted. He made me feel safe, and for a while, that was all I needed. He's 45, intelligent, successful, and has always been the kind of person you can count on. I really thought our life together would be smooth and without any big surprises. But, like everything else, things started to change. Over the last few months, our routine had become almost unbearable. I didn't know if it was the monotony or the fact that we were simply going through our daily lives without much connection. Of course, we have Bruce, his son, who is almost like a son to me too. But he was at university, and honestly, our house was silent without him. When Bruce came back, however, I wasn't prepared for what that would mean. He came back different. Not just physically, which was obvious, but in something deeper, which I couldn't define at the time. He seemed more self-assured, more mature, but that wasn't all. Something had changed in him, and I felt somehow that it affected me. I was in the kitchen that afternoon, absent-mindedly stirring a cup of coffee that was already cold. The day was gray and muggy, as if the weather was also trying to process something. I looked out of the kitchen window at the garden, Frank's flowers beginning to wilt. He had always taken obsessive care of them, but he didn't seem so interested anymore. The house was different, and so was I. I heard the sound of the key in the door, and a twinge of something, perhaps anxiety, went through me. Frank was coming. I went out into the hall to meet him, but before I could say anything, he walked in without saying a word. There wasn't that smile he used to have when he came home. He flopped down on the sofa, letting out a deep sigh, as if all he wanted was a break from the world. "Hi, love," I said, trying to sound natural, but my voice betrayed the tension I felt. I knew he felt it too, but no one was saying anything. Frank looked at me for a second, but quickly looked away. "Hi," he replied, almost as if he had forgotten I was there. He looked tired, more so than usual, yet there was something in his eyes, something distant. The kind of distance you feel when someone is no longer there, but is still physically present. The room was silent, the kind of uncomfortable silence that only comes when words become difficult to say. Frank stood there, motionless, staring at the television without really paying attention. I sat back in the armchair, not knowing what to do with the turmoil inside me. "How was your day?" I asked, trying to start a conversation. But I knew I was being foolish. How could I expect him to want to talk when he was already so closed off? What happened to the spontaneity we had in the early years of our marriage? "Normal," Frank replied, without looking at me, still focused on the screen. His voice was monotonous, and that annoyed me more than it should have. Normal. I wanted him to be more open, more present. I wanted to be able to feel that we were there together, in the same place, but we weren't. There is no together anymore, and I began to realize that. The silence stretched on for a few more minutes, until finally he put down the remote control and with an impatient expression stood up. "I'm sleeping at Sam's tonight," he said without further explanation. I paused for a second, trying to process the information. Sam was a friend of his, but it wasn't the first time Frank had talked about going out, and part of me already knew what that meant. He needed a break. I felt, deep down, that he was moving away from me, from us, from our life together. Perhaps he was beginning to realize what I had noticed for some time. Our relationship was in decline. "Frank," I began, but the word sounded weak, without the weight I wanted it to have. I didn't know what else to say. He wasn't listening anymore. He had already made his choice. "It's better this way," he muttered, as if trying to convince himself that he was making the right decision. And he left. He left the house, taking his cold presence with him. And I stayed there, in the silence of a place that used to be my refuge, now a place where I no longer felt at home. The walls seemed to close in on me, and I knew that, even though he was leaving for the night, things had changed between us. I didn't know if they would ever be the same again. Alone, I went into the living room. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking time that seemed to have stopped. The house was strangely quiet, without Frank's voice or Bruce's presence. Bruce. I hadn't seen him for months, but he had recently returned from university. I laughed nervously, but I couldn't hide my feelings. I'm just tired. I think it's the lack of company, you know? Frank, he hasn't been around much. Yeah, I could tell, Bruce replied, his voice soft but loaded with something I couldn't identify. He moved a little closer, and my breathing became faster. I looked at him, and for a moment, I thought he might be seeing me in a completely new way. I was beginning to lose myself in that look. When Frank left the house to sleep at Sam's, a strange feeling came over me. The silence in the riverside house seemed denser, as if the environment itself was absorbing my loneliness. I knew that Frank needed this space. He was undoubtedly pulling away, perhaps unconsciously, perhaps because there was no longer anything to save between us. That relationship, which had once seemed solid and secure, was now like a house of cards about to collapse. I walked around the house, as if looking for something to do, something to fill the void. It wasn't the kind of emptiness you feel when you're physically alone. It was the kind of emotional emptiness, the kind that only appears when you realize that the connections around you are falling apart. I felt distant from Frank, distant even from myself. The night was cold. The breeze from the street came in through the living room window, making the curtains move gently. I sat on the sofa, staring at the unlit fireplace, the shadows dancing on the empty walls. Then, just like that, I heard the sound of the front door again. It wasn't Frank. It was Bruce. He entered slowly, as if he had felt the same weight in the air as me. His steps were lighter than I remembered, and his face, although still young, had the expression of someone who had already had more experience than he should have for his age. "Hi, Vivian," he said, his voice a little deeper than before. There was something different about him. He no longer looked like the 18-year-old who had left for college. Now he looked like a man, and that bothered me in a way I couldn't explain. "Hi, Bruce," I replied, trying to sound as calm as possible, but I felt a strange tone in my voice. I knew there was something in the air, a tension that hung between the two of us. He seemed to sense it too. He came closer, but didn't sit down immediately. He just stood there in front of me, as if he was waiting for something. I watched his eyes, those eyes that had always been clear, but now had a depth I had never seen before. I found myself lost for a moment, not knowing what to say. "Is everything all right?" he asked, still standing, watching me carefully. "You're different." I laughed, a short, humorless laugh. "Just tired. You know, Frank and I are in a bit of a difficult phase." Bruce nodded slowly, as if he understood more than he should. His eyes, fixed on me, seemed to search every bit of my soul. I tried to look away, but something stopped me. Perhaps it was the need to speak, for someone to listen. Bruce was, in a way, the only person around. He sat down next to me, closer than I expected. A natural move, as if the space between us was enough for a normal conversation. But it wasn't normal. Nothing had been normal since he'd come back. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked, his voice soft but charged with an intensity that disconcerted me. Bruce had never been like this. He had always been a boy, my godson, someone I saw more as a younger brother. Now, his presence was different, more imposing. I took a deep breath, trying to organize my thoughts. I feel like we're drifting apart, you know? Frank doesn't look at me the way he used to. Everything seems to be falling apart and I don't know how to fix it. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the frustration building up. Bruce was silent, but his presence next to me was comforting in a strange way. He didn't judge me. He didn't seem to want to correct me. He just listened, and in a way, that was all I needed at that moment. "I don't think you have to fix anything," he said calmly. "Sometimes things just fall, and you have to let them fall." I looked at him, a little surprised by the depth of it. Bruce had always been intelligent, but he had never said anything like that. He wasn't trying to be philosophical. He spoke with a calmness that touched me. A silence stretched out between us, and, without realizing it, my hand went to the glass of wine on the coffee table. I drank, feeling the warm liquid go down my throat. I needed this, something to relieve the weight that was building up inside me. Bruce watched everything in silence, as if he understood. I didn't know why, but suddenly he seemed to understand me better than Frank ever could. His gaze remained fixed on me, and something in his eyes, in his demeanor, made me feel a wave of warmth. something that had nothing to do with the wine. I was beginning to feel uncomfortable, but at the same time, a part of me didn't want him to leave. Bruce's company had become something comfortable, something I didn't want to lose. Suddenly, he leaned in a little closer, so close that I could feel his breathing, warm and regular. He was so close that I could hear my own heartbeat accelerating, as if he were daring me to continue in that space. I didn't know what to do with the sensation growing inside me, and for a moment I lost myself in those eyes. I looked at him, and something inside me just broke. "Vivian," he murmured, and the way he said my name made my stomach turn. I couldn't think anymore. I couldn't react anymore. He touched my hand. Just a slight pressure, but it was enough to make me shiver. I wanted to pull my hand away, but I couldn't. Something in me told me to let it happen, not to fight it. I knew it wasn't right. He was my godson. He was in many ways like a brother to me. But there, at that moment, all I could feel was the chemistry, the magnetism, the desire that was beginning to grow in me. Something I had never realized before. Bruce, probably sensing the internal struggle going on inside me, said nothing. He just kept his hand on mine, and his touch, gentle, almost as if inviting me to give in, made my heart beat faster. I took a deep breath, trying to pull myself together. "Bruce, we can't. This isn't right." My voice came out lower than I wanted, more fragile than I would have liked, but he didn't move away. He just looked at me with a serious look, but also full of something I couldn't decipher. He was challenging me, or perhaps inviting me to give in to temptation. "Sometimes, Vivian, you need something more, something different." I wanted to reply, but I couldn't. What he said made so much sense, and at the same time, it took me to a place I was afraid of. He saw me, in a way that I was no longer used to being seen. Bruce's hand was still on mine, and all I wanted to do was push him away, but at the same time, there was a part of me that wanted more, that yearned for more. He was so close, so masculine. I was losing control. The tension between us was palpable, and there was no turning back. Something had changed at that moment, and I knew I couldn't ignore what was happening any longer. Ever since Frank had left for Sam's house, I'd had a strange feeling. The air seemed thicker, more charged with a tension that I didn't know where it came from, but I knew it was there, hanging over me. I felt that something was about to happen, but I couldn't understand what, nor did I want to. "Vivian," he said, this time more softly, "I know that something is happening between us, and I'm not here to force anything. We just can't ignore what we're feeling. We can't keep pretending everything's fine when we know it's not." I froze. Those words hit me harder than I was prepared for. How could he know what was going on in my mind? I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that nothing was happening, but I knew I couldn't lie to myself. I was feeling something much stronger than I should have. But that was wrong, wasn't it? I pulled away a little, the air between us now thick and heavy. I tried to organize my thoughts, but the truth was that my mind was a whirlwind. I loved Frank. I had built a life with him. But something in me had changed. Something about Bruce challenged me in a way I couldn't understand. He took a step towards me, but I stopped him with a gesture, raising my hand. "Bruce, stop," I said, my voice breaking for a second. "We can't. This is wrong. I'm married to Frank. He's your father." He stopped, but didn't move away. He stood there, looking at me, and I realized that his patience was almost desperate. He wanted to make me understand something that perhaps I didn't want to hear, but which was somehow beginning to make sense to me. "Vivian," he said again, his tone now firmer but still gentle. "I know this is hard to accept, but at some point, we have to stop lying to ourselves. You're unhappy and so am I. And if it's the truth, I know that you feel what I feel." Those words shook me to the core. How could he be so right? How could he see inside me in a way that even I couldn't? I looked at him, and at that moment, I saw something in his eyes. Something that was no longer those of a boy, but of a man who knew what he wanted. And I was beginning to realize that maybe I knew too. But it couldn't be like that. I was his stepmother. I was married to Frank. I couldn't give in. I couldn't allow everything to fall apart like this. Bruce, sensing my hesitation, took a step back, but he didn't look the same. He wasn't the same boy I knew. He was more resolute, as if he had made a decision, and that made me feel even more confused. "I just want you to know, Vivian," he said, now more distant, as if he was trying to respect the boundary I was still trying to maintain. "I never meant to hurt you. I can't ignore what's happening between us anymore." "I don't know what's going on, Bruce," I began, my voice shaking. "Everything is so confusing. I love Frank, but there's something inside me that's breaking. And you're changing everything." I didn't know if he would understand. Maybe it was too late to try to go back, to recover the woman I had been before all this. But I needed to say it. I needed to get out what was eating me up inside. He took a step towards me, and I could see that he wasn't the same anymore. Something had changed in both of us since that moment when our lives crossed paths in a way that should never have happened. Bruce was more mature, more sure of himself. He was no longer the boy I'd seen growing up, and that disarmed me. "I understand," he said, his voice deep but calm. He sounded so serene, so confident, as if it had all been inevitable. "I know this is hard, Vivian. I didn't want it to be like this, but the truth is that we're both trying to understand something we can't control. And as much as we try to deny it, we already know what's going on." I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling his words reverberate in my mind. He was right, in a painful way. I knew I could no longer ignore what I was feeling, or what he was trying to tell me. I took a deep breath, trying to organize my thoughts. "But this can't happen, Bruce. It's wrong. You're my godson. I'm married to Frank. I can't do that." Bruce moved closer, his expression still charming, charged with an understanding that disarmed me. "I know you're struggling with this, Vivian, and on the one hand, I understand. But life isn't just about rules. Life is made up of moments, of choices. And we both know that this moment has arrived." I felt the weight of every word he said. He was right. There was no ignoring it. It wasn't a question of right or wrong, good or bad. It was something much deeper, something that burned inside me. It was about what I wanted, what I needed, an emptiness that we both felt and could no longer ignore. I tried to push him away, tried to convince myself that it was all a mistake, that I had to resist, fight against what was happening between us. But inside, I knew it wasn't that simple. It wasn't just desire. It wasn't just a momentary attraction. It was a part of me that was screaming to be heard, a part of me that I no longer knew how to control, and which was now finally revealing itself. When he came closer, my breathing faltered. All I wanted was to push him away, but it was impossible. He leaned in, and the instant our lips met, something inside me ignited, as if it were the key to a long-kept secret. I knew there was no turning back. The desire that had been contained, repressed, finally exploded in a way that I could no longer deny. It was as if the world around us had disappeared. There were no more worries, no more reason. There was nothing else but that moment, that touch. And we knew that no one could interrupt us. My husband wouldn't be home that night. It was our chance, and I didn't know whether to fight it or give in completely. And the next thing I knew, we were in bed. It's not over yet. Click on the cards and continue with us.